Burke County, Georgia kept a secret so disturbing that 3 generations refused to speak of it openly. Between March 1838 and September 1839, 17 people died under mysterious circumstances at Willow Bend Plantation, and not a single death certificate listed the true cause. Local physicians burned their records. The county clerk erased entire pages from the official register. When investigators from Savannah finally arrived in October 1839, they found a community united in silence, protecting something far worse than any crime they could imagine. What they discovered in a sealed root cellar beneath the main house would challenge everything the antebellum South claimed about civilization, medicine, and the lengths one woman would go to protect a lie that could destroy an entire family legacy. Before we continue with the story of Cordelia Rutledge and the ritual that consumed Willow Bend Plantation, we invite you to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a comment telling us which state or city you are listening from. Your support helps us bring more forgotten American mysteries to light. The truth began with a death that nobody questioned, because wealthy men dying suddenly in Georgia was common enough in 1838. Burke County stretched across the fertile Savannah River Valley, where cotton grew so thick that plantation owners measured their wealth not in dollars, but in bales per acre. By 1838, the county had become one of Georgia's wealthiest regions, with over 60 major plantations producing cotton that fed the mills of Manchester and Liverpool. The town of Waynesboro served as the county seat, a prosperous community of 3,000 souls where Episcopal churches stood on every corner and social hierarchy was as rigid as iron. Willow Bend Plantation occupied 1,400 acres of prime bottomland along Turkey Creek, about 7 miles southeast of Waynesboro. The main house rose 3 stories high, built in the federal style with columns that gleamed white against red brick. 42 enslaved people worked the cotton fields, while another 18 served in the house, stables, and workshops. The plantation had belonged to the Rutledge family since 1792, passed down through 3 generations of prosperous planters who prided themselves on their English ancestry and refined manners. Cordelia Vance Rutledge arrived at Willow Bend in 1820 as a bride of 19, married to Thomas Rutledge, then 34 and already a widower. She came from Charleston, daughter of a shipping merchant whose fortunes had declined after the embargo years. The marriage was strategic on both sides. Thomas needed a wife to manage his household and provide heirs, while Cordelia's family needed the security of plantation wealth. She was tall for a woman of her time, standing 5 feet 8 inches, with dark auburn hair and pale grey eyes that servants whispered could see through walls. Over 18 years of marriage, Cordelia bore Thomas 5 children: Margaret in 1821, Thomas Jr. in 1823, Catherine in 1825, Edmund in 1828, and finally Elizabeth in 1831. The Rutledge family occupied a position of considerable influence in Burke County society. Thomas served as a county commissioner and owned shares in the Waynesboro Bank. Cordelia hosted elaborate dinner parties and was known for her French cooking and precisely managed household. Neighbors considered her cold but capable, a woman who ran Willow Bend with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. But those who knew her best noticed something else. Cordelia kept extensive journals, writing by candlelight long after the household slept. She read medical texts ordered from Philadelphia and Charleston, unusual for a plantation wife whose education should have focused on household management and music. The plantation's enslaved community whispered about the mistress who walked the fields at dawn, examining workers with the intensity of a livestock appraiser, asking strange questions about their family histories and physical constitutions. Thomas Rutledge appeared to be a typical planter of his era, stern but not exceptionally cruel, focused on profit margins and maintaining social standing. He drank whiskey most evenings, smoked cigars on the veranda, and discussed politics with visiting neighbors. He attended the Presbyterian Church in Waynesboro every Sunday, occupying the Rutledge family pew with his wife and children arranged in order of age. Yet there were irregularities that few outside the family knew about. Thomas kept a separate bedroom from Cordelia after 1832, claiming her nighttime writing disturbed his sleep. He had suffered from recurring digestive complaints for several years, treated by Dr. Silas Pemberton from Waynesboro with calomel and laudanum. The complaints worsened through 1837, though Dr. Pemberton found nothing particularly alarming in his examinations. The enslaved population at Willowbend included 3 men who held unusual positions in the plantation hierarchy. Isaiah Drummond, age 32, worked as the head carpenter and was responsible for maintaining all structures on the property. His father had been a skilled craftsman from Virginia, and Isaiah inherited both the talent and the privileged position that came with essential skills. He was literate, having been taught to read by Thomas's father in the 1810s so he could follow building plans and order supplies. Caleb Tucker, 28, served as the plantation's blacksmith and metal worker. He had been purchased from a failed plantation in South Carolina in 1829, specifically for his smithing skills. Caleb was powerfully built, standing over 6 feet tall, and was known for his quiet intensity and complete focus on his work. Unlike most enslaved workers, he lived in a separate cabin near the forge rather than in the quarters with the field hands. The third man was Josiah Mercer, 26, who worked as Thomas Rutledge's personal body servant and occasionally as a driver supervising field work. Josiah had grown up at Willowbend, born to a house servant named Ruth, who had died of consumption in 1824. Thomas had taken an unusual interest in the boy's education, having him trained in various skills including reading, arithmetic, and the management of other workers. All 3 men shared certain physical characteristics. They were tall, well-built, lighter-skinned than most of the plantation's enslaved population, and possessed skills that elevated them above field labor. All 3 had been granted small privileges, such as keeping a portion of money earned from hiring out their skills to neighboring plantations. And all 3 bore the same peculiar birthmark, a crescent-shaped discoloration on their left shoulder blade, though this detail would not become significant until much later. Life at Willowbend followed the rhythms common to cotton plantations in the Georgia lowlands. Spring planting began in March, the cotton bolls opened in September, and harvest consumed October and November. The enslaved population rose before dawn and worked until darkness, with brief breaks for meals. Cordelia managed the household staff with exacting precision, maintaining inventories of every sheet, spoon, and candle. She personally supervised the kitchen, the dairy, the smokehouse, and the weaving house where cloth was produced for the plantation's use. Thomas spent his days riding the fields, meeting with his overseer, and handling the business correspondence that connected Willowbend to cotton factors in Savannah. He traveled to Waynesboro twice a week for business meetings and social engagements. In the evenings, the family gathered for supper in the formal dining room, where Cordelia enforced strict rules about conversation, posture, and etiquette. But beneath this surface of plantation normalcy, something else was growing. Cordelia's journals from 1836 and 1837, later discovered and partially destroyed, contained increasingly strange observations about bloodlines, inheritance, and what she called the persistence of traits across generations. She had been corresponding with someone in Charleston, letters that arrived in plain envelopes without return addresses. She had also been purchasing unusual medical supplies through a connection in Augusta, including mercury compounds, arsenic preparations, and equipment for what she described in her accounts as hydrotherapeutic treatments. The winter of 1837 to 1838 was particularly harsh in Burke County. Temperatures dropped below freezing for days at a stretch, unusual for the Georgia lowlands. The Savannah River froze at its edges. Enslaved people huddled in their cabins, burning whatever fuel they could gather. In the main house, fireplaces roared constantly, and the family wore layers of wool even indoors. Thomas's health declined sharply that winter. His digestive complaints became severe cramping. He lost weight rapidly, his face taking on a gray, waxy appearance. Dr. Pemberton visited weekly, prescribing various remedies that seemed to provide no relief. Cordelia personally prepared all of Thomas's meals, bringing trays to his bedroom and feeding him broths and tonics of her own making. On the morning of March 3rd, 1838, Thomas Rutledge was found dead in his bed by Josiah Mercer, who had arrived to help the master dress for the day. Thomas was 52 years old. Dr. Pemberton, summoned immediately, examined the body and declared the cause of death to be acute gastric fever with complications of the liver. He noted that Thomas had been declining for months, and that such deaths were regrettably common among men of his age and habits. Cordelia received the news with remarkable composure. She did not weep or cry out. Instead, she immediately began organizing the funeral arrangements with methodical precision. She selected Thomas's burial clothes, drafted the death notice for the Waynesboro newspaper, and sent word to relatives in Charleston and Savannah. She ordered the plantation's enslaved workers to drape the main house in black crepe and prepare the parlor for the viewing. Thomas Rutledge was buried 3 days later in the family cemetery at Willow Bend, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence where his parents and his first wife already rested. The funeral was attended by most of Burke County's prominent families. Reverend Nathaniel Colfax from the Presbyterian Church delivered a sermon about earthly rewards and heavenly rest. Cordelia stood at graveside, dressed entirely in black silk, her face hidden behind a heavy veil, her gloved hands folded calmly at her waist. What no one knew was that the morning after Thomas's death, before the body was even cold, Cordelia had gone to the root cellar beneath the kitchen house. There, she retrieved a locked wooden box she had hidden among the stored vegetables. Inside were letters, medical receipts, and a small journal bound in black leather. She spent an hour reading through these documents by lamplight, her face expressionless. Then she returned them to the box and hid it in a new location, beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet. The day after the funeral, Cordelia summoned Isaiah Drummond, Caleb Tucker, and Josiah Mercer to the main house. She met them in Thomas's former study, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. She told them that they would be taking on new duties that would require absolute discretion and obedience. She explained that she had been instructed by a European physician specialist in a new medical treatment that would preserve her health and allow her to continue managing the plantation effectively. The treatment required assistance, and they had been selected for this purpose. None of the 3 men had any choice in the matter. Cordelia owned them as completely as she owned the furniture in the room. They listened as she described what would be expected of them, and though the instructions were strange and disturbing, they understood that refusal was impossible. Cordelia's gray eyes remained fixed on each man as she spoke, and there was something in that gaze that suggested far more than simple authority. There was knowledge, dark and specific, that seemed to pin each man in place. The ritual would begin the following morning at Turkey Creek. Turkey Creek wound through the southern portion of Willow Bend Plantation, a clear stream about 20 feet wide that flowed year-round, even in drought. The creek was spring-fed, and its water remained cold even in summer. Cypress trees grew along its banks, their roots creating natural seats and steps down to the water. The enslaved population used the creek for washing clothes on designated days. But generally, it remained quiet and isolated, hidden from the main house by a grove of live oaks and thick undergrowth. On the morning of March 7th, 1838, 4 days after Thomas Rutledge's funeral, Cordelia walked to Turkey Creek at first light. She wore a simple gray dress with none of the mourning finery she displayed publicly, and she carried a bundle wrapped in linen. She was followed at a distance by Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, who had been instructed to arrive separately so as not to draw attention. The morning was cold and damp, with fog rising from the creek's surface. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance a hound barked at the plantation house. The world was just waking up, and in that liminal hour between night and day, the creek seemed to exist outside of normal time. Cordelia stopped at a particular bend in the creek where a large flat rock jutted into the water, creating a natural platform. She set down her bundle and turned to face the three men who stood uncertainly on the bank. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and matter-of-fact, as though she were giving instructions for building a fence or slaughtering a hog. She explained that they would all enter the water together. She would remove her clothing, and they would do the same. They would stand in a circle in the waist-deep water, and she would perform certain ablutions on each of them and on herself. They would remain silent throughout the process. They would tell no one about these sessions, which would occur every morning at dawn. Any man who spoke of what happened at the creek would be sold immediately to the worst slave trader she could find, sent to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where men died within 5 years. But beyond the threat, there was something else in her voice. A certainty, a knowing. She looked at each man and said their names in a particular way, a way that suggested she knew things about them that no one else knew. Things about their fathers, things about their blood. Isaiah was the first to step into the water, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the far bank. Caleb followed, his massive shoulders rigid with tension. Josiah came last, and those who later heard his account said he looked like a man walking to his own hanging. Cordelia removed her dress without hesitation or modesty. She wore nothing beneath it. Her body was pale in the early morning light, marked with the faint stretch marks of 5 pregnancies. She stepped into the cold water without flinching, moving to the center where the current ran strongest. She instructed the 3 men to form a triangle around her, facing outward. What happened next would be described years later in testimony that some claimed was exaggerated by trauma and others insisted was precise truth. Cordelia produced from her bundle a collection of items: a razor, several glass bottles containing clear liquids, pieces of cloth, and a small, leather-bound book. She opened the book and read aloud in a language none of the men recognized, something that sounded like Latin, but wasn't quite. She then proceeded to wash each man with water drawn from the creek in a specific pattern: shoulders, chest, arms, back, legs. She used one of the liquids from her bottles, which burned slightly on the skin and smelled of chemicals and herbs. She recited phrases as she worked, her voice steady and rhythmic. The men stood rigid, staring at the trees, the sky, anywhere but at her, or at each other. When she finished with the 3 men, she performed the same washing ritual on herself, her movements precise and methodical. Then she produced the razor and made small cuts on each man's left shoulder, directly over the crescent-shaped birthmarks. The cuts were shallow, but deliberate, and she collected the blood that welled up on pieces of white cloth. She mixed this blood with more liquid from her bottles, and then applied the mixture to her own chest and abdomen, rubbing it into her skin while continuing to recite from the book. The entire process took perhaps 30 minutes. When it was finished, Cordelia instructed the men to dress and return to their normal duties. She told them to come back tomorrow at the same time. She dressed herself, wrapped her items back in the linen bundle, and walked back toward the main house without looking back. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah stood on the creek bank for several minutes after she left, unable to speak or even look at each other. Finally, without a word, they went their separate ways to begin the day's work. But something had changed. Each man felt it, a heaviness in his chest, a confusion in his thoughts. It was as though something had been taken from them and something else left in its place. The ritual was repeated the following morning, and the morning after that, and every morning thereafter. Sometimes Cordelia varied the procedure slightly, using different liquids, cutting in different places, reciting different passages from her book. But the essential elements remained the same: the dawn hour, the cold water, the nakedness, the washing, the blood, and the words. Within 2 weeks, people at Willow Bend began to notice changes in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. The 3 men, who had previously been among the most capable and alert workers on the plantation, began to move as though in a fog. They performed their tasks adequately but without the initiative or skill that had distinguished them. Their eyes took on a distant, glazed quality. They spoke little, even to each other, communicating in brief, flat sentences when necessary. Rachel, one of the house servants who had known Josiah since childhood, later testified that it was like watching a man slowly disappear from inside his own body. He still looked like Josiah, still walked and talked like him, but the essential spark that made him who he was seemed to be draining away day by day. She tried asking him what was wrong, but he just stared at her as though he didn't quite recognize her, then turned and walked away without answering. The other enslaved people noticed too. Whispers began in the quarters at night. The three men were being worked with roots, conjured, hexed. Mistress Cordelia had learned dark magic from somewhere, perhaps from New Orleans where such things were known. The men were being poisoned slowly, their minds stolen, but no one dared speak openly about it, and certainly no one dared confront Cordelia herself. In the main house, Cordelia's children noticed their mother's strange new routine. She rose before dawn every day, regardless of weather, and was gone for about an hour. When she returned, her hair was often damp, and she would go immediately to her room to change clothes. When young Edmund, then 10 years old, asked where she went, she told him she was taking morning constitutionals for her health, walking by the creek. She advised him not to follow her, as the early morning air was dangerous for children with weak constitutions. Margaret, the eldest daughter at 17, was more suspicious. She had always been perceptive, and she noticed not only her mother's absences, but also the changes in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. She noticed that her mother kept the black leather book with her at all times now, even sleeping with it under her pillow. She noticed that her mother had lost weight despite eating normally, and that there was a feverish energy about her, a brightness in her eyes that seemed unnatural. One morning in early April, Margaret tried to follow her mother to the creek. She dressed quietly and slipped out of the house just as Cordelia disappeared into the oak grove. But Cordelia seemed to have anticipated this. She was waiting just inside the tree line, her face cold with fury. She grabbed Margaret's wrist hard enough to leave bruises and told her daughter in a voice barely above a whisper that if she ever followed again, if she ever spoke to anyone about her mother's morning walks, Cordelia would see to it that Margaret never married, never left Willowbend, never had anything approaching a life of her own. Margaret, frightened by the intensity in her mother's eyes, fled back to the house. That night, Margaret wrote in her own diary, a leather journal she kept hidden in her wardrobe. She wrote that her mother had become something she no longer recognized, that there was a wrongness emanating from her like a smell, that whatever was happening at the creek was evil, though Margaret had no clear understanding of what evil meant beyond what she had learned in church. She wondered if she should tell someone, but who? Her father was dead, Reverend Colfax. What would she even say? Margaret decided to watch and wait. She began observing her mother more carefully, noting small details. The chemical smell that sometimes clung to Cordelia's clothes. The way she would stare at Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah during the day, studying them like specimens. The locked box that appeared in her mother's room, a box that hadn't been there before her father's death. Meanwhile, the spring planting season had begun in earnest. The fields required constant attention. Cordelia supervised the work with her usual efficiency, meeting with the overseer, checking the accounts, ensuring that every task was completed properly. To the outside world, she was exactly what a plantation widow should be. Capable, composed, managing her late husband's estate until her eldest son came of age to take over. But at night, alone in her room, Cordelia wrote in her journals by candlelight. She recorded observations about the three men's deteriorating conditions. She noted changes in their vitals, their responsiveness, their physical capabilities. She wrote about dosages and frequencies. She referenced passages from medical texts and correspondence with someone she referred to only as Dr. H. She wrote about her own physical sensations, changes she believed were occurring in her body, improvements in her health that she attributed to the treatments, and she wrote about her late husband Thomas, though these entries were cryptic and bitter. She wrote about lies and discoveries and betrayals. She wrote about bloodlines and inheritances. She wrote about the need to correct what had been corrupted, to purify what had been tainted. Her handwriting in these passages became increasingly erratic, the letters slashing across the page with violent energy. If this disturbing ritual was giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the nightmare that consumed Willowbend Plantation. By May 1838, the changes in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah had become impossible to ignore. All three men had lost significant weight. Their movements had become slow and uncoordinated. Isaiah, who had been capable of building complex structures from memory, now needed written instructions for even simple repairs. Caleb's metalwork became sloppy and imprecise. Josiah could barely remember instructions given to him an hour earlier. Dr. Silas Pemberton noticed the deterioration when he visited Willowbend in late May to check on the family's health. The doctor was 63 years old, a graduate of the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, and had been practicing in Burke County for over 30 years. He was a small, neat man with precise movements and a reputation for thoroughness, though his medical knowledge was limited to what had been taught in the 1790s and what he had learned through decades of trial and error. Cordelia had invited Dr. Pemberton to examine young Elizabeth, who had developed a persistent cough. While treating the child, the doctor happened to see Josiah Mercer carrying firewood to the house. He was struck by the man's gaunt appearance and trembling hands. Later, while leaving, he encountered Isaiah attempting to repair a shutter and noticed the same disturbing symptoms: weight loss, tremors, and a peculiar vacant expression. Dr. Pemberton mentioned his observations to Cordelia, asking if there had been illness among the workers. Cordelia explained that the three men had been suffering from a recurring ague common in the lowlands, something she had been treating with quinine and calomel. The doctor accepted this explanation, as malaria was indeed endemic to the region and often caused such symptoms. He offered to examine the men more closely, but Cordelia declined, saying she had the situation well in hand. However, Dr. Pemberton was troubled enough to mention what he had seen to his colleague, Dr. Francis Calloway, during a meeting of the Burke County Medical Society in Waynesboro later that week. The two physicians discussed the symptoms over brandy, trying to determine if there was some new fever spreading through the enslaved population. Dr. Calloway suggested that perhaps the men had been exposed to contaminated water or spoiled food. Dr. Pemberton agreed this was possible, but noted that no other workers at Willowbend seemed affected. The conversation would have ended there, forgotten among the countless medical discussions that occupied physicians' time, except for one detail. Dr. Pemberton mentioned that Mistress Rutledge had claimed to be treating the men with quinine and calomel, but he had not observed the characteristic blue-gray discoloration of the gums and tongue that calomel typically produced when used regularly. This discrepancy lodged in his mind like a splinter. In early June, something happened that brought the situation at Willowbend to wider attention. Isaiah Drummond collapsed while working on repairs to the plantation's cotton gin. He simply fell forward, unconscious, and could not be revived for several minutes. When he came to, he could not remember where he was or what he had been doing. His speech was slurred, and one side of his face seemed to droop slightly. The overseer, a man named Marcus Delacroix, reported the incident to Cordelia. She visited Isaiah in the carpenter's cabin where he had been taken to rest. She examined him briefly, then ordered that he be kept in his cabin and given only water and bread until he recovered. She said the man had been drinking, though Marcus knew for certain that Isaiah never touched alcohol and there was no whiskey smell about him. 2 days later, Caleb Tucker suffered a similar collapse at the forge. He had been working iron when his legs simply gave out beneath him. Other workers found him lying on the ground, semi-conscious, muttering incoherently. Like Isaiah, he recovered slowly and could not explain what had happened. Cordelia's response was the same: isolation and minimal food. The enslaved community was now deeply frightened. 2 of their strongest men who had never been sick a day in their lives, were wasting away before their eyes. The whispers became more insistent. Mistress Cordelia was killing them slowly. She was feeding them poison or working roots on them. Some remembered old stories from Africa and the Caribbean about people who could steal souls, who could turn strong men into hollow shells. An elderly woman named Dinah, who had been brought from the Congo decades earlier and was respected for her knowledge of herbs and healing, approached Josiah Mercer one evening in mid-June. She begged him to tell her what was being done to him and the others. Josiah stared at her with those empty eyes and said nothing. Dinah tried pressing a protective charm into his hand, a small bag of roots and stones, but Josiah let it fall to the ground and walked away. Dinah went to the overseer Marcus Delacroix, a rare step for an enslaved person to take, as it risked severe punishment. She told him that the mistress was doing something evil to the three men, that she was draining their life force at the creek every morning. Marcus dismissed her claims as superstitious nonsense and threatened to have her whipped if she spread such wild stories. But privately, Marcus was beginning to have his own doubts about what was happening at Willow Bend. Marcus Delacroix was 35 years old, born in Louisiana to French-speaking parents, and had worked as an overseer on various plantations throughout Georgia and South Carolina. He was not a kind man. His profession did not allow for kindness, but he was observant and practical. He knew that plantations operated on routine and order, and what was happening at Willow Bend was disruptive to both. He had noticed Cordelia's dawn absences. He had noticed the three men's deterioration. He had also noticed that the mistress seemed to be thriving in a way that was unusual for a recent widow. She had more energy, seemed younger somehow, moved with a vitality that contradicted her 43 years. It was as though whatever was draining from the three men was flowing into her. Marcus began making his own observations. He started rising early, positioning himself where he could see the path to Turkey Creek. He watched Cordelia walk that path each morning, followed separately by Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. He never went close enough to see what actually happened at the creek. Something instinctive told him that would be dangerous. But he noted the timing, the frequency, the absolute regularity of the ritual. He also began searching for information about Cordelia's background. He spoke casually with the house servants, asking about the mistress's habits, her interests, her correspondence. He learned that she received letters from Charleston regularly, letters that arrived in unmarked envelopes. He learned that she had been purchasing unusual supplies from Augusta through a connection at an apothecary shop. He learned that before her marriage to Thomas Rutledge, Cordelia had spent 2 years at a girls' academy in Philadelphia, unusual for a Southern woman of her generation. By late June, Marcus had accumulated enough concerning details that he considered going to the county authorities. But what exactly would he report? That a plantation mistress was taking morning walks with 3 of her slaves, that those slaves had developed mysterious health problems, that the enslaved community believed in root work. None of this amounted to any crime that the authorities would care about. Enslaved people died of fevers and mysterious ailments all the time. As long as the plantation remained productive and no white people were threatened, the law had no interest in what happened to black workers. What Marcus did not know was that someone else was also investigating Cordelia's activities, someone with far more resources and far more dangerous intentions. In Charleston, a man named Victor Kensington had been waiting for over a year to hear from Cordelia Rutledge. Kensington was 52 years old, a physician who had been stripped of his medical license in Pennsylvania in 1829 after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at the Philadelphia Hospital for the Insane. He had fled to Charleston, where he established himself as a medical consultant, serving wealthy clients interested in alternative treatments and unconventional therapies. Kensington specialized in what he called vital transfusion therapy, based loosely on theories of animal magnetism and life force that had been popular in Europe in the late 1700s. His treatments involved complex rituals combining bloodletting, hydrotherapy, chemical preparations, and psychological manipulation. He claimed he could transfer youth, health, and vitality from one person to another, that he had discovered the secret of rejuvenation that alchemists had sought for centuries. Most of his clients were desperate people with money. Men facing death from wasting diseases, women terrified of aging, individuals seeking any miracle that medicine could not provide. Kensington charged exorbitant fees and produced elaborate documentation of his successes, though anyone investigating closely would find that most of his patients either died or disappeared shortly after treatment. Cordelia had first encountered Kensington in 1836 during a trip to Charleston to visit her family. She had attended a private lecture he gave at a salon hosted by one of Charleston's intellectually curious wealthy widows. Kensington spoke about the latest European theories of vital force and the possibility of controlling aging and disease through proper manipulation of the body's inherent energies. Cordelia, who had been quietly studying medical texts for years, was fascinated. She arranged a private consultation with Kensington at his offices on Church Street. There, in a room lined with anatomical drawings and jars of preserved specimens, she told him something she had never told anyone else. She believed her husband had been systematically deceiving her about the paternity of their children. The story Cordelia revealed to Kensington was complex and dark. She explained that she had discovered through careful observation and years of suspicion that at least 3 of her 5 children might not be Thomas's biological offspring. She believed Thomas had been sterile or near sterile, the result of a venereal disease he had contracted in his youth. Rather than admit this shameful secret, Thomas had arranged for other men to impregnate Cordelia without her knowledge or consent. Cordelia claimed that Thomas had been drugging her periodically during their marriage, using laudanum and other substances to make her compliant and confused. During these episodes, other men had been brought to her bed. She believed Thomas had selected enslaved men from the plantation, men who resembled him enough that any children produced would be assumed to be his. This would allow Thomas to maintain the fiction of his virility and ensure the Rutledge line continued. She had no definite proof, Cordelia admitted, but the evidence was persuasive. Her first child, Margaret, looked nothing like Thomas, and bore a striking resemblance to certain physical features she had observed in the enslaved population at Willow Bend. Her second son, Thomas Jr., was darker complexioned than either parent, with hair texture that suggested mixed ancestry. She had noticed the same crescent-shaped birthmark on 3 of her children that she later observed on Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, 3 men who had all been born at Willow Bend in the years just before her own children. Whether Cordelia's theory was true or a delusion born of years of unhappy marriage and isolation is impossible to determine with certainty. But she believed it absolutely, and that belief had transformed into an obsession that consumed her completely. She told Kensington that she wanted revenge. She wanted to destroy the men who had been used to humiliate her, to violate her without her knowledge or consent. But more than revenge, she wanted something else. She wanted to reclaim what had been stolen from her. She wanted to take back her youth, her vitality, her power. She wanted to reverse the damage that years of childbearing and betrayal had inflicted on her body and mind. Kensington listened to all of this with the calm attention of a man who had heard many desperate confessions. He told Cordelia that what she wanted was possible, that his treatments could accomplish exactly what she desired. But the process would be difficult, lengthy, and required absolute secrecy and commitment. He could not come to Willow Bend to supervise the treatments himself. His presence would draw too much attention. Instead, he would provide detailed written instructions, the necessary chemical preparations, and ongoing guidance through correspondence. The cost would be substantial. $5,000, paid in installments, plus the cost of supplies. Cordelia agreed immediately. She had her own money, inherited from her father and carefully managed over the years of her marriage. She would pay whatever Kensington asked. Over the next year, 1836 to 1837, Cordelia received a series of letters from Kensington outlining his treatment protocol. The instructions were elaborate and specific. She was to select 3 male subjects who matched certain physical criteria and who represented the men she believed had violated her. She was to begin preparing them through gradual introduction of certain chemical compounds mixed into their food, compounds that would make them suggestible and compliant. Once Thomas died, Cordelia could begin the full treatment protocol, which involved daily ritual bathing, bloodletting, application of various tinctures and preparations, and recitation of specific verbal formulas that Kensington claimed would facilitate the transfer of vital energy from the subjects to herself. The formulas Kensington provided were a mixture of legitimate medical terminology and complete fabrication. He borrowed from Franz Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism, Samuel Hahnemann's homeopathic principles, and various European occult traditions, blending them into something that sounded scientific, but was essentially theatrical poison. The chemical preparations he sent included mercury compounds, arsenic solutions, digitalis extracts, and various alkaloids derived from plants. These substances, administered in carefully calibrated doses, would gradually destroy the subject's nervous systems while creating the illusion of vital force being drained away. The psychological component was equally important. Kensington instructed Cordelia to maintain absolute dominance over the subjects to create an atmosphere of inevitability and helplessness. The nakedness, the cold water, the bloodletting, the incomprehensible verbal formulas, all were designed to break down the subject's sense of self and resistance. The regular dosing with chemicals would do the rest, gradually destroying cognitive function, while Cordelia convinced herself that she was absorbing their youth and vitality. But Kensington had another purpose beyond simply providing Cordelia with her desired revenge. He was documenting everything she reported back to him, compiling data for a monograph he planned to write about vital transfusion therapy. Cordelia's case was perfect. She had access to subjects who could not refuse or report the experiments. She had the intelligence and education to follow complex protocols, and she was motivated by a fanatical belief that made her the ideal collaborator. He had no moral qualms about what he was asking her to do. To Kensington, enslaved people were simply convenient experimental subjects, no different from the asylum patients he had used in Philadelphia. There was, however, one element of the arrangement that Kensington had not revealed to Cordelia. He had been corresponding with another party, someone else in Burke County, who had their own interest in what was happening at Willow Bend Plantation. This third party was paying Kensington a substantial additional fee for regular reports on Cordelia's activities and state of mind, and this same party was preparing to use the information for purposes that would destroy Cordelia completely. July 1838 brought oppressive heat to Burke County. Temperatures climbed above 90 degrees by mid-morning and stayed there until sunset. The air hung thick and still, heavy with moisture from the Savannah River. In the cotton fields, enslaved workers moved slowly through the rows, tending plants that grew lush and green in the wet heat. In the main house at Willow Bend, the family retreated to the coolest rooms and tried to sleep through the worst of the afternoon heat. Cordelia continued her dawn rituals without interruption, despite the weather. If anything, she became more intense in her application of Kensington's protocols. She increased the dosages of chemicals she administered to Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. She extended the duration of the creek sessions, sometimes keeping the men in the water for over an hour. She added new elements to the ritual: forced ingestion of bitter tinctures, application of caustic substances to their skin, collection of other bodily fluids beyond blood. The 3 men were dying. Anyone with eyes could see it. Their skin had taken on a yellow, waxy appearance. They moved like ghosts, barely present in their own bodies. Isaiah could no longer work at all and spent his days sitting motionless in his cabin. Caleb collapsed twice more at the forge, before Cordelia ordered him confined to quarters. Josiah alone continued to function at some minimal level, moving through his duties like an automaton, his eyes completely empty. But the overseer Marcus Delacroix had finally found the evidence he needed to act. In mid-July, While Cordelia was occupied with visitors from Waynesboro, Marcus entered her bedroom and searched through her belongings. He found the locked box hidden beneath the floorboard in her closet. Using a pry bar, he forced it open. Inside were Kensington's letters, dozens of them, outlining the entire treatment protocol in explicit detail. There were also Cordelia's own journals, describing each session at the creek with clinical precision. There were receipts for chemical purchases from Augusta. And most damning, there was a letter Cordelia had begun but never finished, addressed to Kensington, in which she expressed doubt about whether the treatments were actually working or whether she was simply murdering 3 innocent men to satisfy her own madness. Marcus took several of the most incriminating letters and one of the journals. He replaced the box carefully and left the room exactly as he had found it. Then he rode immediately to Waynesboro to consult with an attorney named Howard Pritchard, a man he knew to be both discreet and ambitious. Pritchard read through the documents Marcus had brought with growing astonishment. What Marcus had uncovered was not just evidence of cruelty to enslaved workers, which no court would seriously prosecute, but something far more valuable. Evidence that Cordelia Rutledge was mentally unfit to manage her late husband's estate. The letters and journals revealed a woman in the grip of delusion, paranoia, and possibly homicidal mania. If properly presented, this evidence could be used to have Cordelia declared legally incompetent, which would necessitate the appointment of a guardian to manage Willowbend and its assets. Pritchard explained to Marcus that several prominent men in Burke County had been waiting for an opportunity to seize control of Willowbend. Thomas Rutledge's death had left the plantation temporarily in Cordelia's hands, but the property was extremely valuable, and there were parties who believed they had legitimate claims to it. With evidence of Cordelia's insanity, these men could petition the court to remove her from control and install a guardian of their choosing. But Pritchard advised caution. They needed to build a stronger case, gather more witnesses, and time their move carefully. If they acted too quickly, Cordelia might destroy evidence or flee with her children to Charleston. They needed to let the situation develop a little longer, let Cordelia's behavior become even more indefensible, then strike decisively. Marcus agreed to wait, though he insisted something must be done about the 3 dying men. Pritchard promised to arrange for Dr. Pemberton to make an official examination, which would create documentation of their condition. This documentation would be crucial for the legal case. What neither Marcus nor Pritchard knew was that Cordelia had already discovered the break-in. She had noticed immediately upon returning to her room that the floorboard was slightly displaced. A single scratch on the wood, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, told her that someone had pried up the board. She checked the box and could tell from the arrangement of the letters inside that they had been disturbed. She knew immediately that it was Marcus. No one else would have had the courage or the reason. The overseer had been watching her too closely, asking too many questions. She had made a mistake, trusting that her position as plantation mistress would protect her from scrutiny. She had forgotten that white men's loyalty to each other superseded any obligation to women, even wealthy white women. Cordelia's response was swift and ruthless. That same evening, she summoned Marcus to the house and dismissed him from his position, effective immediately. She paid him the wages owed and told him to leave Willowbend before sunrise. Marcus tried to argue, but Cordelia's cold fury silenced him. She told him that if he attempted to spread lies about her, if he tried to use stolen documents against her, she would use her family's connections in Charleston to destroy him completely. She would ensure he never worked as an overseer again, anywhere in Georgia or South Carolina. Marcus left Willowbend that night, but he took with him the letters and journal he had hidden in his saddlebags. He went directly to Howard Pritchard's office in Waynesboro, and the 2 men began preparing their case in earnest. The dismissal of Marcus Delacroix created an immediate crisis at Willowbend. Cordelia needed to find a new overseer quickly, as the plantation could not function without someone managing the day-to-day operations of the enslaved workforce. She promoted a man named Samuel Gentry, who had been working as a driver, to temporary overseer. Gentry was competent, but lacked Marcus's experience and authority. The enslaved population sensed the instability and began to test boundaries, working more slowly, pretending not to hear orders, engaging in small acts of resistance. Cordelia responded by increasing punishments and tightening control. She authorized more frequent whippings for minor infractions. She reduced rations. She imposed a strict curfew and forbade any gatherings after dark. The atmosphere at Willowbend became oppressive and fearful, a pressure cooker of resentment and terror. Meanwhile, her dawn rituals at Turkey Creek continued without interruption. Isaiah Drummond died on July 28, 1838. He simply stopped breathing during the night, his body finally giving up after months of chemical poisoning and abuse. Cordelia ordered him buried quickly in the enslaved cemetery at the edge of the property, with no ceremony or mourning allowed. She recorded his death in the Plantation ledger as fever and consumption, and immediately intensified her treatments of the remaining two men, as though Isaiah's death had somehow strengthened rather than discouraged her obsession. In early August, Margaret Rutledge made a desperate decision. She could no longer remain silent while her mother descended into madness and murder. She wrote a letter to her maternal aunt in Charleston, Catherine Vance, describing in careful detail what she had observed at Willowbend. Her mother's strange behavior, the dawn absences, the deterioration of the three enslaved men, Isaiah's recent death, and the pervasive sense that something evil had taken hold of the plantation. Margaret mailed the letter secretly through a trusted house servant who was sent to Waynesboro on an errand. The letter reached Charleston 10 days later. Catherine Vance, a widow herself and a woman of considerable social standing, was horrified by what she read. She immediately wrote to Dr. Pemberton, asking him to visit Willowbend and assess Cordelia's mental state. She also wrote to the county probate judge, expressing concern about her niece's welfare and her sister-in-law's fitness to manage the Rutledge estate. These letters, arriving almost simultaneously with the legal maneuverings Howard Pritchard was orchestrating, created a convergence of pressure on Cordelia. By late August, multiple parties were moving against her, though she was not yet aware of the full extent of the conspiracy. Dr. Pemberton visited Willowbend on August 20th, ostensibly to check on the family's health. He examined all 5 children and found them reasonably healthy, though young Edmund showed signs of nervous strain. When the doctor asked to examine Caleb Tucker and Josiah Mercer, whose deteriorating conditions had been reported to him, Cordelia initially refused. She insisted the men were suffering from ordinary summer fevers and that she was treating them appropriately. Dr. Pemberton pressed the issue, and Cordelia finally relented. She led him to the cabin where Caleb lay in a filthy cot, barely conscious. The doctor's examination revealed extreme emaciation, signs of heavy metal poisoning including blue-gray discoloration of the gums and fingernails, neurological damage evidenced by tremors and lack of coordination, and what appeared to be chemical burns on the man's shoulders and chest. Dr. Pemberton was shocked. These were not symptoms of any natural fever. He insisted on examining Josiah as well, and found similar signs of poisoning and abuse. He confronted Cordelia directly, asking what treatment she had been administering. Cordelia, her composure finally cracking, told him about the European physician's protocol, about the therapeutic bathing, about the tinctures and preparations designed to cure her own declining health. Dr. Pemberton listened with growing alarm. He recognized some of the chemicals Cordelia described as extremely toxic. Mercury, arsenic, digitalis in concentrations far beyond therapeutic doses. He told Cordelia bluntly that she was not curing herself, she was murdering the 2 men. He said he would be reporting his findings to the county authorities and that she needed to stop the treatments immediately. Cordelia's response was chilling in its calm rationality. She told Dr. Pemberton that he had no authority over what she did with her own property. The 3 men had been selected for a specific purpose, a purpose the doctor could not possibly understand. They had violated her in ways that transcended physical assault. They had participated, knowingly or not, in her husband's scheme to humiliate and degrade her. They deserved what was happening to them, and besides, the treatments were working. She felt stronger, younger, more vital than she had in years. The transfer was real. Dr. Pemberton left Willowbend deeply disturbed. He rode directly to Waynesboro and filed a formal report with both the county sheriff and the probate court. His testimony, combined with the documents Marcus Delacroix had provided to Howard Pritchard, created an overwhelming case against Cordelia. On September 3, 1838, Sheriff Benjamin Talmadge arrived at Willowbend with a court order. Cordelia Rutledge was to submit to examination by a panel of physicians to determine her mental competence. Pending the results of this examination, a temporary guardian would be appointed to manage the plantation and supervise her children. Cordelia was not under arrest, but she was effectively stripped of all authority. The examination took place 3 days later at the courthouse in Waynesboro. 3 physicians, including Dr. Pemberton, questioned Cordelia for over 4 hours. They asked about her beliefs regarding her husband's alleged conspiracy, her understanding of medical science, her reasoning behind the treatments she had administered. They examined her physically and mentally, looking for signs of hysteria, mania, or delusional thinking. Cordelia, realizing that everything she had worked toward was collapsing, tried to present herself as rational and composed. But when the physicians pressed her on specific details, her underlying obsession became impossible to hide. She insisted that her theory about Thomas's deception was based on careful observation and logic. She defended Kensington's protocols as scientifically sound. She argued that the improvement in her own health proved the treatments were effective. She showed no remorse for Isaiah's death or concern for the suffering of Caleb and Josiah. The panel's conclusion was unanimous. Cordelia Rutledge was suffering from severe delusional disorder and was mentally incompetent to manage her affairs or care for her children. They recommended immediate intervention and long-term supervision. The court appointed Margaret's aunt, Catherine Vance from Charleston, as temporary guardian of the Rutledge children and estate. Catherine arrived at Willowbend in mid-September with her own household staff and immediately took control. She moved Cordelia to a locked bedroom in the main house, essentially making her a prisoner in her own home. She ordered the dawn rituals at Turkey Creek stopped permanently. She arranged for proper medical care for Caleb and Josiah, though Dr. Pemberton warned that the damage done to their bodies was likely irreversible. Cordelia accepted her confinement with eerie calm. She had lost, she understood that, but she did not believe she had been wrong. In her mind, the conspiracy against her had simply been more powerful than her ability to resist it. Thomas had won, even from the grave, by ensuring that people would think her mad rather than believe the truth of what he had done to her. Catherine Vance began the process of investigating what had actually happened at Willowbend. She hired investigators to track down Victor Kensington in Charleston. They found his offices abandoned, his landlord reporting that he had left the city suddenly in early September, owing several months' rent. His personal effects had been removed, but investigators found hidden documents that revealed the full scope of his fraudulent medical practice and his correspondence with Cordelia. More disturbing was the discovery of letters between Kensington and Howard Pritchard, the attorney who had worked with Marcus Delacroix. These letters revealed that Pritchard had been Kensington's other client, the third party who had been paying for reports on Cordelia's activities. Pritchard had been deliberately allowing the situation at Willowbend to deteriorate, waiting for Cordelia to commit acts so heinous that her removal would be legally unquestionable. He had been planning to have himself appointed as guardian of the estate, which would have given him control of Willowbend's substantial assets. The conspiracy unraveled when Catherine presented this evidence to the probate court. Pritchard was disbarred and fled Burke County before he could be prosecuted. Marcus Delacroix, who had been an unwitting pawn in Pritchard's scheme, provided testimony about everything he had observed. The court acknowledged that while Cordelia had indeed committed terrible acts, she had also been manipulated by Kensington and allowed to spiral into madness by men who saw profit in her destruction. The question remained, what had Thomas Rutledge actually done? Had he truly orchestrated the complex deception Cordelia believed, or had her theory been pure delusion from the start? Catherine Vance commissioned a private investigation, hiring a former Charleston police detective to examine the question. The detective spent weeks reviewing Willowbend's records, interviewing elderly servants, and tracing the histories of Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. What he discovered was both more complicated and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Thomas Rutledge had indeed suffered from mumps in his 20s, an illness that often caused sterility in adult men. Medical records from his first marriage showed that his first wife had never conceived during 8 years of marriage, unusual for a couple with no apparent fertility issues on the wife's side. But Thomas had not drugged Cordelia or arranged for enslaved men to impregnate her against her will. Instead, he had done something far more calculating and cruel. He had deliberately fathered children with enslaved women before his marriage to Cordelia, children he kept at Willowbend and raised as valuable skilled workers. When Cordelia failed to conceive during the first 2 years of their marriage, Thomas had begun a campaign of psychological manipulation, suggesting that perhaps the problem was with her, that perhaps she was barren, that perhaps God was punishing her for some sin. Then, when Cordelia did conceive, after Thomas had started giving her fertility tonics that were actually just harmless herbs, he encouraged her to believe the children were miracles, proof of divine intervention. But Cordelia, perceptive and intelligent, had noticed the physical resemblances between her children and certain enslaved workers. She had drawn conclusions that were partially correct. Her children did share bloodlines with Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, but not because those men had been brought to her bed, because those 3 men were Thomas's children, her children's half-brothers, making her own offspring products of Thomas's earlier relationships with enslaved women. Thomas had kept his mixed-race children at Willowbend, given them elevated positions, taught them skills, and even provided small privileges, all while maintaining the fiction that they were simply talented workers. He had created a complex web of secrets and lies, never intending for Cordelia to learn the truth. He had assumed his secrets would die with him. But Cordelia, through years of observation and suspicion, had pieced together a version of the truth that was close enough to reality to drive her to madness. She had been correct that her children shared blood with the 3 men. She had been correct that Thomas had deceived her about the fundamental nature of their family. But she had constructed the mechanism of that deception in a way that transformed her from victim into perpetrator, from wronged wife into murderer. Caleb Tucker died on September 24, 1838. His body finally succumbing to the accumulated poison Cordelia had administered over 6 months. Josiah Mercer survived, but remained in a state of permanent cognitive impairment, unable to work or care for himself. He lived another 8 years at Willowbend, cared for by other enslaved workers, a living ghost of what he had been. Cordelia Rutledge was never prosecuted for murder. Under Georgia law in 1838, the killing of enslaved people by their owners was not legally considered murder, though it could be prosecuted as malicious destruction of property. Catherine Vance, horrified by the entire situation and wanting to protect the Rutledge children from further scandal, arranged for the matter to be handled quietly. In November 1838, Cordelia was committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. She lived there for 14 years, dying of pneumonia in 1852 at age 57. Hospital records describe her as a quiet patient who spent her days writing in journals that the staff regularly confiscated and destroyed. She never recanted her beliefs about Thomas's conspiracy, never expressed remorse for the men she had killed, never acknowledged that she had been manipulated by Victor Kensington. The Rutledge children were raised by their Aunt Catherine in Charleston. Margaret married a physician from Philadelphia in 1842 and never returned to Georgia. Thomas Jr. attended university in Virginia and eventually sold Willowbend in 1856, wanting nothing to do with the plantation where such horror had occurred. The younger children, Catherine, Edmund, and Elizabeth, were told edited versions of what had happened, stories that omitted the worst details of their mother's crimes. Victor Kensington was never found. Some reports placed him in New Orleans in the early 1840s, still practicing his fraudulent medicine under a different name. Others claimed he had fled to Mexico or South America. He left behind dozens of victims across the American South, people he had exploited with false promises of rejuvenation and vitality transfer. By 1850, his name had disappeared from all medical directories and city records, as if he had never existed at all. The truth about Thomas Rutledge's secret children was never made public during the lifetime of anyone involved. The children he had fathered with enslaved women, except for the 3 Cordelia had murdered, were sold away from Willowbend after Catherine Vance took control of the estate. Their descendants, scattered across Georgia and beyond, never knew their connection to the prominent Rutledge family. Willowbend Plantation continued to operate under various owners until the Civil War. The main house was burned by Sherman's troops in 1864 during the March to the Sea. After the war, the property was subdivided and sold to former Confederate soldiers trying to rebuild their lives. By 1880, the original plantation had been broken into 6 separate farms, and the name Willowbend had been largely forgotten except by the oldest residents of Burke County. Turkey Creek still flows through what was once the Rutledge property, clear and cold, but the banks where Cordelia conducted her rituals became overgrown and avoided by local people. In the 1870s and 1880s, freedmen living in the area refused to fish or wash clothes in that particular bend of the creek. They told their children that the water there was cursed, that it had tasted blood and would never run clean again. By the 1890s, even white farmers avoided the spot, though they could not say exactly why, except that it felt wrong, that the air seemed heavier there, that birds did not sing in the cypress trees along that stretch of water. In 1891, a farmer plowing land that had once been part of Willowbend's fields unearthed a wooden box buried about 3 feet deep. Inside were glass bottles with residues of strange chemicals, rusted medical instruments, and water-damaged papers covered in handwriting that had faded to illegibility. The farmer, unsettled by the discovery, reburied the box and never spoke of it to anyone except his wife. When he died in 1903, she burned his diary, which contained a description of the find, saying only that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The most chilling remnant of the Cordelia Rutledge case surfaced in 1899, when a Charleston attorney named Robert Dunmore was settling the estate of an elderly widow named Catherine Vance, who had died at age 94. Among her personal effects, carefully preserved in a locked trunk, was a collection of letters and documents related to her sister-in-law's crimes at Willowbend 60 years earlier. One letter in particular stood out, written by Cordelia to Margaret in 1846 from the asylum in Milledgeville. Dunmore read the letter only once before deciding it should never be made public. He described its contents years later to a colleague, saying, "The woman wrote with such clarity about her own madness, such understanding of what she had done and why, that reading her words was like looking into an abyss. She knew she had murdered innocent men. She knew the physician who advised her was a fraud. She knew her theory about her husband's conspiracy was built on fragments of truth twisted by paranoia into something monstrous. But even knowing all of this, even after years of confinement and reflection, she could not say she would have acted differently. That was the most disturbing thing, not that she was mad, but that she understood her madness and embraced it anyway." Dunmore burned Cordelia's letter along with most of the other documents from Catherine Vance's trunk. He kept only a few items: receipts from the asylum showing payments for Cordelia's care, a brief account Margaret had written in 1840 describing her mother's final lucid conversation before being committed, and a single page from one of Cordelia's journals, dated March 10, 1838, 1 week after Thomas's death and 3 days into the Creek rituals. The journal entry, which Dunmore preserved because he believed it was historically significant despite being deeply disturbing, read, "I have begun the treatments Dr. H. prescribed. The 3 subjects responded as expected to the initial procedures. I felt nothing during the first session, no transfer of vitality, no sensation of renewal. But today, the 3rd day, I felt something. Perhaps it was only the cold water shocking my body to wakefulness. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of finally taking action after years of helpless rage. Or perhaps the treatments do work, and what I felt was the beginning of the restoration Dr. H promised. I cannot yet be certain. But I know this: I will continue. I have gone too far to stop now, even if doubt whispers that I am simply murdering 3 men to feed a delusion. The doubt itself must be crushed. Faith in the treatment is part of the treatment. I must believe. This single page remained in the Dunmore family archives until 1947, when the attorney's grandson donated it to the Georgia Historical Society, along with a brief explanatory note. The society catalogued it, but did not display it or make it available to researchers, judging the content too disturbing and the provenance too questionable. It remains in their restricted collection to this day, available only to scholars who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. In Burke County, the story of Cordelia Rutledge and the rituals at Turkey Creek became a cautionary tale whispered among the elderly, a story about the dangers of grief and obsession, about the evil that could flourish in a society built on slavery and absolute power. But with each retelling, details were altered or forgotten. By the 1920s, most people who heard the story assumed it was pure legend, a ghost story invented to frighten children away from dangerous water. The last person who remembered the events firsthand was a woman named Sarah Drummond, born in 1835, who had been Isaiah Drummond's niece. She lived to the remarkable age of 106, dying in 1941. In her final years, living with her great-granddaughter in Augusta, she would sometimes speak of her uncle Isaiah, the carpenter who had been murdered by the mistress at Willow Bend. She described him as a kind man, talented and intelligent, who'd been given no choice but to obey when called to the creek each morning. She said that toward the end, he had told her that dying was not the worst part. The worst part was forgetting who he was while still being alive, feeling himself disappear piece by piece while his body continued to function. Sarah wept when she spoke of this, even 70 years after his death, saying that some cruelties were so profound they echoed across generations. When Sarah Drummond died in 1941, the last living link to the Willow Bend horror died with her. The few documents that survived, scattered across family archives and historical society collections, were too fragmentary to tell the complete story. Future generations would know that something terrible had happened at a plantation in Burke County in 1838, that a woman named Cordelia Rutledge had been committed to an asylum for unspecified crimes against enslaved workers, that 3 men had died under mysterious circumstances. But the full scope of the horror, the psychological complexity of the crime, the web of deception and fraud that had enabled it, all of this was lost to time. What remains is Turkey Creek, still flowing through Burke County, its water still cold and clear. The bend where Cordelia conducted her rituals is unmarked and unremarkable, indistinguishable from 1,000 other places along 1,000 other southern creeks. But the water remembers. The land remembers. And in the memories of descendants who still live in Georgia, scattered fragments of the story persist, distorted by time but never quite disappearing, like bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing can fully erase. This mystery shows us how easily desperation and betrayal can transform a person into something unrecognizable. How the systems of power and oppression in the Old South created conditions where such horrors could occur with minimal legal consequence. It reveals the darkest aspects of a society built on slavery, where human beings could be tortured and killed with almost no accountability, where women's rage and trauma could find expression only in violence against those even more powerless than themselves, where medical charlatans preyed on the desperate and vulnerable, and where family secrets could poison multiple generations. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Cordelia was a victim driven to madness or a murderer who used her circumstances as justification? Could anyone have stopped what happened at Turkey Creek before it was too late? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.